Hello and welcome everyone to Gahad channel. My guest today is Laetetia Bader. Laetitia, as most of you will know, is the Horn of Africa Director of Human Rights Watch. And I invited her today to ask her about issues of justice and accountability in relation to the Tigray war. Laetitia, she has a very, very busy schedule, but she has taken time to join me today. So thank you very much for joining me today, Laetitia.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, so I think it's very difficult where to begin in terms of human rights situations in the Tigray war in the light of the sheer amount of crimes that have been committed by the various actors. But I think maybe one safe place to start would be what happened after the signing of the agreement between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government on the 2nd of November. So it's now 4 months since the agreement has been signed. And 2 days after the signing of the agreement, Human Rights Watch issued a press release making a number of points. And some of the points that Human Rights made was it pleaded essentially with the various actors to make sure, for instance, that there is a mechanism for human rights monitors to go and visit places such as Western Tigray, for the AU to have a mechanism to ensure that obstruction of aid wasn't anymore applied, and a number of other recommendations. And what is your assessment in terms of how much of your recommendations have been heeded and how much of them have been ignored, given that 4 months have been have passed now?
Well, as you say, and as we commented on at the time, I mean, we were concerned and publicly criticized the limited and quite vague references to formal accountability in the agreement. But we strongly believe that ongoing investigations or future prosecutions are not in any shape or form contrary to the agreement. In fact, the agreement actually explicitly calls on warring parties to condemn certain abuses, for example, sexual violence. And this is something we have continued to underscore and to say is that ongoing abuses and notably ongoing reports of some of the worst forms of sexual violence to date are a violation of the cessation of hostilities, are a violation of the agreement. Now, what is unclear to your question is how are these being monitored or called out? As you say, we have repeatedly called on the African Union to ensure that within the monitoring and verification mechanism, there would be human rights experts, gender experts, but also humanitarian experts that would look at some of these violations, including ongoing restrictions on humanitarian assistance or obstruction of humanitarian assistance, and would see these as central to the agreement and the rolling out of the agreement. But to your question, it's very hard to see at this point how those sorts of recommendations have been taken on. We have not been seeing public reporting around these violations from some of the key stakeholders and parties to the agreement. I mean, there's also other angles we are concerned about. And that's, for example, big questions around how the agreement and the backers of the agreement are going to engage on issues around accountability for Ethiopia's allied forces in the conflict, and that is in particular the case for the Eritrean forces. So I think there are a lot of big questions, and I think there are still lots of answers, and the ball is really in the court of both the warring parties, the signatories of the agreement, and also the backers of the agreement to show how they are going to fulfill the commitments that are laid out in the agreement around some of these critical human rights issues.
So to add one more point in this regard, Laetitia, you also said then that federal authorities, to Ethiopian authorities, should give access to the international human rights experts on Ethiopia then. And not only have they not given access to the team of experts, as you will be aware, they have been actually campaigning to terminate the mandate of the experts of the UN body of experts. What is your reaction to that, to the Ethiopian government and apparently the Eritrean regime, it has to be said, trying to terminate the mandate of the commission? And do you think they might actually succeed in that mission? And what is the danger if they indeed succeeded in achieving that?
I mean, we are very, very worried. I mean, of course, the Ethiopian government has taken quite a hostile position towards the commission since its establishment in December 2021. We've seen the Ethiopian government using a whole range of tactics, some of which were unprecedented, including moves at the level of New York, which is not in theory a venue, a forum where decisions which are made in Geneva should be reopened. But the government has on 2 occasions tried to get the Commission of Human Rights Experts defunded at the level of New York. So these are both moves that we are worried about from a point of view of investigations in Ethiopia. We firmly believe that given both the scale, the gravity of the abuses which have unfolded, but also the ongoing deliberate attempts and efforts, first and foremost from the federal government, to make real-time on-the-ground reporting so difficult. I mean, as we know, as we speak, access to the Tigray region in particular, but also other conflict-affected areas for journalists, for example, for human rights monitors are incredibly, incredibly restricted. And so from that point of view, we firmly believe that there is a need for ongoing in-depth investigations. So from that point of view, the decision and the government's threats to present a resolution at the March session of the Human Rights Council to end the mandate is a problem. But from another point of view, this is unprecedented. Many organizations are very worried about what this could mean, not only for the Commission on Ethiopia, but for many other commissions. If you start having governments who decide mid-mandate to question a decision which was made by states from across the globe to put a mandate in place. So technically, the mandate of this commission ends in September. That was voted on, the resolution was passed, and the agreed conduct of states at the Human Rights Council is they abide by those decisions. So we are also very concerned about the precedent this could represent going forward more generally for the work of the Human Rights Council, but also, as we know, in the speech which was made by the Deputy Prime Minister to the Executive Committee. I mean, the threat was also on the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, ongoing commission of inquiry. So this is really an attack on independent, international and regional investigations and efforts. And it is very worrying.
So, I mean, you say that the move is an unprecedented attempt, and something that I find extraordinary is the argument that the Ethiopian regime presents is when it says that when it pushes for determination, the basic argument they say is that we are pursuing justice anyways using local institutions, and that any attempt by external bodies is actually counterproductive. That is the basic kind of the thrust of the argument that they make. What do you make of the line of argument by the Ethiopian regime, taking into account again that they are one of the parties to the war and they are being investigated, and for them to say that actually they could adopt an independent position, an impartial position, and investigate crimes when in fact, as you said, they don't even actually seem to have a mechanism to, for instance, bring perpetrators from Eritrea to account. So what do you make of the claim by the Ethiopian regime that they have enough in their repertoire to pursue justice in Tigray?
Well, I mean, there are many countries in the world where, especially where there has been conflict and sort of abuses we've been seeing in the last 2.5 years in Ethiopia, where there are domestic accountability efforts going on and there are international efforts. These do not need to be, they don't need to be efforts which are going against each other. They are more often than not complementary. So I think starting from that standpoint and saying this happens in many different contexts in the world, and actually often they have different roles to play and they are critical. I think we also have, from the beginning of the conflict, based on our research over many years in Ethiopia, but including in the first 2 years of the Abiy administration, seen how on a number of occasions, particularly following bouts of violence and security force abuses in the Oromia region, for example, seen how commitments to investigate what were also quite complex crimes and dynamics never really resulted in credible accountability. So this was the starting point for why, from very early on, we believed it was so important for there to be ongoing, independent, international investigations, regional investigations outside of the domestic effort. But what we've also seen from the beginning, and I would say especially in the early phases of the conflict, has been a piecemeal approach from the authorities and a very delayed approach. Now, as you know, I mean, especially in the first year, first of all, we saw the government responding very quickly when it came to the large-scale killings in Maikadra, sending in an investigative team very quickly. But for months, for example, it denied the presence of Eritrean forces on the ground. It downplayed allegations of sexual violence, for example. Then the Axum massacre, which, as you know, both Human Rights Watch and other organizations, including Amnesty International, documented a massacre in, again, a worrying response from the Ethiopian government. Initially, the government released a statement which was saying that most of those killed had been fighters. Then shortly after, it revised its findings. But even to date, it is not clear what steps the government has taken to hold the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces to account for that massacre. Then, following the joint investigation, which was carried out by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I mean, positively, the Ethiopian government did agree to follow up on some of the recommendations. And as you know, they established an interministerial task force. But one of our big concerns there is it in many ways that there appears to date to have been very limited prosecutions coming out of that effort. The government regularly refers to a couple of dozens cases that have apparently been tried in the military courts, but with absolutely no details about proceedings, about ranks, who are these individuals who've been held to account. And the lack of transparency is worrying in many, from many points of views, but also one of the big concerns there is the military court system is not a system in which victims and survivors are going to be part of that process. And what is absolutely key, critical, and evident is that whatever happens in terms of formal accountability or more informal accountability processes, the most affected communities and the survivors need to be centered and need to be central to that. So we are very concerned, for example, by a draft bill which was presented to Parliament, which would hand over jurisdictions, notably for war crimes, to what is a very opaque military court system in Ethiopia. So we've seen both, I would say, a piecemeal approach. We haven't seen, for example, to date, the interministerial task force, when they presented a report last September, said that there would be new phases to their investigations, which should, in theory, also take place in Tigray, would also look into events in Western Tigray zone. But to date, there have been no updates on how those investigations are happening, if they're happening at all. And how the task force can really make sure that the abuses across the region are investigated. So, you know, the concerns have been piecemeal, lack of transparency, real questions about how victims are going to have a voice in these processes, and also really how formal accountability is going to be central to broader also efforts around transitional justice, etc. going forward. I mean, one very concrete example also in terms of our concerns around lack of real follow-up to very serious crimes. In the joint investigation we did with Amnesty International, we found into events in Western Tigray zone where we found that crimes against humanity had been committed. We identified 3 individuals that we believe to bear both individual or command responsibility. And we called for these 3 individuals to be investigated. But to date, we have not seen any movements on those files. So yes, I mean, I think there are real questions about what has happened in terms of domestic accountability so far. There are big unanswered questions, as I mentioned earlier, around how to ensure accountability, notably for the Eritrean forces abuses. But there is also a bigger point that domestic accountability is obviously going to be critical. There is clearly, and this has come up in our research, not only in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray in particular, but also in Oromia and many parts of the country over the years, there is a real lack of trust in state institutions. And so again, how is the government planning to address that? The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have done some consultations, although not yet in Tigray, to ask communities about what would accountability, what would healing look like. And it was very clear from those discussions that there is a real lack of trust in government institutions. And this is a reality which comes up in our reports. And it's one which the government, first and foremost, cannot deny.
Question. So I was asking you if you have trust and confidence in the Ethiopian bodies, in the local bodies like the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Interministerial Task Force and the other bodies who have been charged by the Ethiopian government to deliver some sort of justice in relation to the war. Now, given their kind of past performance in terms of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, for instance, working in collaboration with the UN body and the Interministerial Task Force, you said that they have actually tried to do some sort of military court and other efforts. How much confidence do you have in them? And when you factor in the issue of Eritrea, do you believe that they could actually execute some sort of delivery of justice in Tigray?
I mean, I think, you know, as we said from the beginning, there is a role for many different actors to play. And I think what is concerning, as you pointed out, in terms of the current government effort to undermine and scupper basically the work of the Human Rights Commission at the level of Geneva is this argument that there can be only one approach. And obviously what we have seen from the government side is they have been very resistant to any approach which is not in one way or another linked to federal government institutions. And I think what we will argue there is that that cannot be the case and should not be the case. And especially in a context, as we've said before, where there have been so many different actors involved and so many crimes, but also where for such a long time there has been such a deliberate effort and attempt to destroy evidence, to prevent investigations, to prevent the preservation of evidence as well. And I think, you know, in a context, and here we're not only speaking about communities who have been affected by the conflict in northern Ethiopia, we're talking about many communities who are facing the brunt of security force abuses. You know, as we speak, there continues to be serious abuses in Western Oromia in particular, in communities which for almost 4 years now have been caught between a rock and a hard place, between an insurgency and a counterinsurgency operation. And, you know, it is also important for those communities to have choices of who they speak to, and, you know, who they believe will do them the best form of justice, who they trust. And I think trust is so central to moving forward, and it's obviously so central also to any sort of healing process. So again, this is where we have and we continue to raise concerns with existing domestic accountability efforts, domestic investigations. But what we say is that, of course, they need to happen. And of course, and it's very clear, there needs to be a broader effort to reform the domestic accountability systems, and real political will to do that, to create systems which all communities are going to trust again. But in the meantime, investigations need to happen. Independent, international, regional, ongoing investigations need to happen as we speak. And so again, this shouldn't be either or, and it is absolutely critical for the government to recognize that and to give the space also for different views and voices to be heard, and for them to have their avenues and channels in which their experiences are channeled into.
To take you back to the attempt by the Ethiopian government to terminate the mandate of the UN body, for someone like me who's not an expert in how the international system generally operates, there's something that I find beyond belief, which is that the various actors in the international community seem to entertain, at the very least, the request by the Ethiopian government to terminate the mandate. And for me, and for any observer of what has been happening in Tigray for the past 2 years, it's absolutely clear why the Ethiopian government would want to terminate. This is a government that has denied them access to go to Tigray. This is a government that has, like you say, denied any sort of atrocities in Tigray. This is a government that has denied the presence of Eritrean forces until it was impossible to deny. And the government would, of course, want to terminate the mandate because it wouldn't want to be exposed in terms of what has happened in Tigray. So why various bodies in the international community even entertaining the request? But that's one thing that I find very, very difficult to understand, really.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It is alarming. It is incredibly disappointing. I mean, I think we have repeatedly highlighted what we think have been the failings of the international regional response to what has been happening for the last 2.5 years. And there is absolutely no doubt that, again, you know, the response is lacking in some ways. There definitely is a lot of support still, and a lot of acknowledgement of the need for investigations, and accountability continues to be put forward as a priority of a lot of Ethiopia's international partners as well. Now, I think one of the concerns is that hasn't always materialized into anything very concrete. It's not always very clear what that actually means and what that commitment looks like. But, you know, we hope that at a minimum, there will continue to be support for the work of the International Commission. I mean, I think, you know, there is both a very pragmatic but also idealistic reasons as to why stakeholders cannot accept to brush what are, of course, very complex issues under the carpet here. I mean, first of all, as I was just saying, I think it is so key for Ethiopia's international partners, but all the elite who are, you know, involved at the moment, the elites of the warring parties, those who have signed the cessation of hostilities agreements, you know, are they really listening to those who've been most affected by this conflict? Do they even try, are they really trying to understand what redress, acknowledgement, and healing can look like? So that's the idealistic viewpoint. That needs to happen. But I think there's also a pragmatic one, which we have seen, and if anything, the last 2.5, 3 years in Ethiopia is a devastating illustration of how impunity, which has continued again and again in Ethiopia for so many years, is not going to resolve underlying grievances or help move the country forward. So a lot of the time, I would say the compromises which we've seen the international community making on Ethiopia has been based on a belief that this is the only way to get the country to a better space. And I think it is so clear that impunity does not get the country to a better space. And so, you know, we hope that message will be made clear. I think it's one which obviously in our own research, our interviews with individuals, with survivors, we hear again and again this feeling of voices not being ignored. And of course, I mean, you know, there are many different calls we hear around what healing will look like. You know, at the moment, of course, for a lot of communities in the Tigray region, it's also access to basic critical services and quality access. But it is also about formal accountability and those who have been the most responsible for these horrific abuses being held to account. And it is clear that, you know, those views cannot be brushed under the carpet.
Laetitia, you say that there are efforts to try to hold perpetrators to account, and I presume you are saying that because you would be privy to think that I am not, and the average kind of observer is not. But for someone like me who bases his understanding of what is happening in Tigray on what is available to the public, for instance, the agreement in Nairobi and Pretoria, the word justice or accountability, they're not even mentioned in any serious way. And even the TPLF or the Tigray government is not calling for accountability now. I think the reason is, as part of the agreement, they have been muzzled to keep quiet. And as we just mentioned, the Ethiopian government is trying to terminate the mandate of the UN. Whether it succeeds or not remains to be seen. So the sentiment among the Tigrayan community who observe these things in public, the sentiment, the kind of the overarching sentiment you get now is one of pessimism, to say that already the various actors are trying to say, let bygones be bygones, let's just bury the issue of justice and accountability under the carpet and move on, and that any talks of attempts to hold perpetrators to account is actually counterproductive to the peace process. That seems to be the understanding, and that is common actually for people to say, if you were, for instance, to say there should be justice, there should be accountability, people should be held to account, it's not beyond the pale for some people to say you are actually trying to destroy the peace process. You should just keep quiet and let the two parties work out the details. And are the members of the Tigrayan community who are very, very pessimistic justified in their pessimism in saying that the international community is actually trying to ignore and forget the issue of justice?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I understand where that pessimism is coming from, and I think, you know, if you look, the signs are not particularly positive. I think, as you spell out as well, the silence of the Tigray government is also worrying. But as we said, I mean, we were concerned about the limited space in the agreement to questions of accountability, but we do believe that it is also a question of how you interpret, how you commit, how you roll out the commitments in those agreements as well. And I think it is absolutely critical, of course, for different voices to spell out how there are commitments around accountability. And, you know, as I was saying earlier, that ongoing violations, ongoing abuses, ongoing harm to civilians. You know, the question of, for example, of the full and quality restoration of services. I mean, all these are issues which the communities most affected should be speaking out on. And it's one, of course, that we are continuing to underscore as well. I think the whole question of trying to brush accountability under the carpet is a global problem. And I think there is obviously often a question of political will, of how much, you know, people are willing to really push for that not to be the case. And I think a key message is there cannot be double standards. We are seeing this at the moment, where there is a massive international push to ensure that the crimes which have been committed in Ukraine are not brushed under the carpet. And I think our message is that the victims and the communities who've been affected by the horrific abuses of the last 2.5 years in northern Ethiopia are given the same chance, are accorded the same rights to have their voices heard. Again, why ongoing investigations are so critical. I mean, again, let's remind ourselves of, this is a conflict where there has been every attempt to ensure that the victims' voices are not heard. Again, if you think of double standards in terms of what people have been able to hear in terms of the voices of individuals affected by the abuses in Ukraine. And so I think there really is a key message to say here, that all victims deserve to have the sort of accountability they want, and is important for them. And I hope we will see this, of course, happen in Ethiopia as well. But I also understand the pessimism right now. And this is where I think it is absolutely critical that everyone involved continues to highlight how important this is.
Yeah, especially on the issue of Western Tigray, Laetitia, I think it was in March of 2020 that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International issued a joint report detailing the horrific atrocities. I think you used the term ethnic cleansing, and we actually justify why you used the word ethnic cleansing, and the US had already said that ethnic cleansing had happened in Western Tigray, but there has been, on the part of the US, at least in public, a climb down. They don't use the term anymore, ethnic cleansing. And I think the worry, again, I don't want to interrogate you on this, or I want us to go into other topics, but the worry among the Tigrayan community that the same would happen to the other atrocities as well, just like the US now no more said that ethnic cleansing had happened, even though they had already said that they have determined that that's what had happened. Maybe the same kind of climb down on the other things would happen. I think that is where the pessimism on the part of the Tigrayan community comes from. I suspect. But in terms of, again, Western Tigray, even in the recommendation press release that he issued following the agreement, you say that special access should be given to Western Tigray, to detention centers, to mass graves, and to humanitarian workers to Western Tigray. But none of that has happened as far as I'm concerned. And if anything, what we know with the people in Western Tigray are still being ruled by the very people who committed the atrocity crimes. So maybe, I don't know if you have something to add. I'm just expressing my frustration here. Maybe I shouldn't be saying that, but
no, absolutely. And from our point of view, I mean, first of all, we continue to receive reports of forced expulsions of Tigrayan communities from Western Tigray zone. The sort of access, as you say, that we were calling for, of independent international humanitarian access, that is so critically needed. Access to detention facilities has still not been granted. And, you know, if there is one area which has been repeatedly put on the back burner, and the realities and the lived experiences of communities who are still there, but also who have been cleansed from this area is repeatedly ignored, and we agree that a lot of the recommendations we had put forward in that reporting have not been followed through on, and this is, you know, we characterized and we found in our report that this was constituted crimes against humanity, and these are the sort of very serious international crimes which should and require a massive global response. And so, yes, absolutely. It's obviously, from our point of view, there is, of course, a big political question, which we don't take a position on, but there are immediate, urgent needs of communities. And of course, needs of the communities, even those who have been recently forcibly evicted, who've been arriving in Shiraro, massive, urgent medical, humanitarian, psychosocial needs as well, because of what they've been facing in Western Tigray zone for over 2 years now. So real concerns and points absolutely taken. Much more needs to happen, and the response needs to be much more concerted.
So I don't know how much you would be able to tell me about this, but if you don't have much to say, I would be fine if you just say that I don't want to talk about this. But anyway, I just wondered what the bodies like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are doing now to make sure that there's a measure of justice and accountability in Tigray. Is there anything that you are actively working on now?
I mean, as I said, I mean, we continue to monitor the situation, try to understand what is happening on the ground as we speak. As you know, I mean, there has been a restoration of some of the basic services in key towns and urban areas, but that is far from being the case across Tigray. And so, you know, what is really happening in terms of access, humanitarian access, but also access to basic needs, etc., outside of urban areas is still absolutely a concern to us, and one we continue to raise. And as I said from the beginning, I mean, we continue to push at many different levels to ensure that there is space and scope for ongoing investigations into what has been happening there since the beginning of the conflict and to date as well.
I asked that because the consensus now seems to be to say that war is kind of over, and there hasn't been any sort of reporting coming, although we do from time to time hear that there are atrocities being committed by Eritreans, for instance, in some villages like Irob and Western Tigray, for instance. But everybody seems to have sort of closed shop and just left the scene, and no one is doing any sort of reporting. So that is why I am asking if there's an attempt to try to cover what might be happening now, because the forces might be committing crimes on the cover of a peace deal.
I mean, what we've seen since the beginning of the conflict is that abuse is continued even when there wasn't fighting. And I think it's important for everyone to remember that and to continue to make sure that they are watching. And again, I mean, I think there is a very important responsibility on the part of the backers of the cessation of hostilities to keep an eye on these very issues which are, you know, at the heart, and which are the commitments which have also been made by the parties to the agreement as well. So I mean, I agree with the concerns, as you know, and as I mentioned earlier, it is still incredibly difficult for journalists to access the region. And so, you know, again, we are still operating in a context, even if there has been some restoration of services, where real-time reporting is incredibly difficult, in a context also where you have many different actors and forces involved controlling different parts of territory. Again, this can and is having an impact on communities' abilities to move around safely, etc. And so that is not only hampering access to humanitarian assistance, it's again making the collection of information on the situation very difficult as well.
Yeah, so maybe to take this kind of conversation into a bit more kind of philosophical direction, what do you say to the people who believe, and there are many people who seem to believe that the issue of justice and accountability shouldn't be given a priority if there is a prospect of peace. That seems to be what the Ethiopian government believes. That seems to be what the Tigray government believes now. They seem to believe that we could kind of forget and ignore the issue of holding perpetrators to account and just talk about peace. That seems to be the governing belief that they have. What do you say to that? To those who believe that that is the way forward?
I mean, I think I won't take it down the philosophical direction, but I think a very concrete one, as I said before. I think, you know, in Ethiopia, we have a very clear context where decades of impunity, of serious abuses, which have gone without any real credible form of formal or informal accountability, has resulted in the context in which we are today in, where we are talking about a country with multiple layers and multiple areas of human rights crises. And so, as I said before, it is absolutely essential that accountability is central to the actions and efforts and political, etc., to take the country to a space where those who have been most affected by events of recent years, but also past abuses, really feel that they have a voice, feel that they have been given the tools to start healing again. And so, as I said, I think there is an idealistic position. I think there's also a very pragmatic reason as to why it is so critical.
And we're about to wrap up, Laetitia, so just bear with me maybe 5 minutes. Do you have any words of advice to the Ethiopian regime or to the Tigray government, to the AU and to the US and the European Union? I think there are various kind of stakeholders in this, to make sure that at least a semblance of justice is delivered to the victims, of whom there are millions. I think the official estimate of the number of people who have died for one reason or another, but related to the war, is close to 1 million. So there are millions of people waiting for some sort of justice. And like we discussed, the Ethiopian government is trying to scupper the issue of justice, is trying to terminate the mandate of the UN body. So from where we are now, what do you advise the various stakeholders to do?
Well, I think on several levels this needs to happen. I mean, you know, one of the concerns at the moment we also have is obviously we have seen increasing restrictions on what was an already restricted civic space in the country. We've been seeing increasing arrests of journalists. And I think why I raise this here is that this not only has an impact on key voices not being heard, and I think it is critical that these discussions and these decisions are not only made at the elite political level, but are also being made and where you really see the space for an engagement from people from across the country and from all different communities. And you know, I think it is critical for Ethiopia's international partners to be pushing back on efforts by the government to make that incredibly difficult, to make the voices that are for you know, their efforts to choose whose voices are heard increasingly hard. So there is a bigger question of making sure that the international community is speaking out against that. But there is also, you know, there needs to be concerted efforts to push back on hostile actions by the Ethiopian government, for example, as we've discussed at the level of the Human Rights Council, to, you know, end international scrutiny of what's going on on the ground. And you know, investigations in themselves are important, but investigations in the aim of paving way to some sort of accountability is critical. And that can take time, of course, but the investigations need to happen now. And that's why, again, it is critical for the international community, but also the AU and other regional governments who have backed the cessation of hostilities agreement to be also pushing back on this, and to be pushing back on the argument which we heard at the level of the African Union 2 weeks ago from the Ethiopian government, that these investigations and these efforts undermine the peace process. They do not. They are complementary, they are critical, and they are central also to the commitments which were made in the cessation of hostilities agreement as well. And so I think it is critical that publicly and in other forums, some of the arguments which are being made by the government to shrink space and to also undermine these efforts that could one day pave the way to accountability, which are also efforts which potentially could center the voices of many of the victims of this conflict at the heart of them. You know, there needs to be much more concerted effort to push back on that.
Well, I hope that at least some of the words of advice will be heeded, but not just your words of advice now, but also we have written multiple reports into atrocities in Tigray by all parties, although it's the crime is committed by the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces are of a different dimension and quality to the ones by Tigray, but that's a separate discussion. And my assessment is that I have been reading reports written by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and by various other bodies in preparation for this interview. And the overriding sense that I came out with is that most of the things that I have written have been ignored for the most part. I think it could be said. And I hope that at some point, maybe some people would start to listen to what you are saying. But thank you for taking the time today and joining me. I know that you have very busy schedule, so I'm doubly grateful to you for taking the time today, Laetitia. If you have something to add, please feel free. Otherwise, we will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you.